Ari, as I was writing my bracketology column early Sunday morning, the thought thundering in my head was, I'm pissing somebody off here. I know I'm going to piss somebody off here. I may as well just suck it up and do it here.
Yeah, the Georgia being the first four out, you and I agreed on that. I was writing mine at 2 a.m, and I was actually just panicking that I was losing or missing something because it was really late and I was tired. And then I realized that, like, no, this is right. Like, there's going to be really good teams that are out of this thing. And, I made some pretty interesting decisions. It seems like you agreed on some and you didn't on others. But yeah, like I'm seeing Miami out on yours. Like that, that's a tough decision. I'm seeing BYU in on yours. That's a tough decision because you have Colorado that might match up well with them.
I just wanted to let you take the Colorado clickbait, I think. But I'm with you. I think Colorado at this point is going to play for the Big 12 title. And I think if you get in a Colorado BYU game, there's a very good chance Colorado wins. So that's why I have Colorado on the first four out.
I think a lot of people actually view that as clickbait. But like if you actually look at Colorado's route, it's very reasonable. Like it's right there. Like they just can't lose again, which with the way that they're playing right now, they're not playing anybody for the rest of the year that they cannot beat. And then if they get into a one-game playoff scenario in Dallas, Texas, with Dion leading the way, like I just don't think that they would lose that game. So I Kansas is playing well. That's on the road. That might be tough. Oklahoma
Utah looked good against BYU.
Utah was competent.
Colorado now has a game worth of film on Brandon Rose, the Utah quarterback, who I would say was the biggest difference. For Utah against BYU. So at least Colorado will have a chance to see what that looks like. BYU did not have the luxury of seeing what that offense would look like with Brandon Rose running it.
And it's like kind of tough too to really get a gauge on BYU because that was a rivalry game that was on the road. I don't think they blocked particularly well on Saturday night. I feel like they were lucky to win. And even if they would have lost the Utah game, we would still be sitting in the same position. They would just be with a loss, and you would have to decide who you think is going to win the Big 12, and it probably would have still come down to BYU and Colorado. But like I'm just thinking, like, who's ascending upward? I think it's incredible that BYU continually finds ways to win games that it seems like they were going to lose. They've done it now 2 or 3 times this year, and they're a resilient team, and Jake Retzlaff is a really good player. But right now, I just think that Colorado is playing on a pretty high plane, and Andy, they've got really, really good players that BYU just doesn't have. So like that's a second
Darius Lassiter against Travis Hunter is going to be so much fun if that's what winds up happening in the Big 12 championship game. I'm there for that. Let's talk about now. I will tell you why I have BYU where I do, and because I did put SMU in as the ACC champ, which look, SMU and Miami still probably on a collision course to play in the ACC championship game. Could be a one-game scenario, but I don't know that Miami can definitely beat SMU. I think that's probably a pretty fun game that I don't know the result of. And so I was like, let's put SMU in here this time. But the problem is if you put SMU in that spot, they have to be below BYU because what is SMU's one loss? BYU.
Right. That's a very difficult thing. And, speaking of where to slot teams, SEC is having a really good comeuppance of teams. And like, to me, that's where the number one problem is. You have, as we explained on our show on Saturday night, 5 or 6 teams, for instance, that might finish the season at 6-2. I think there's a pretty good chance of that happening. And if that does happen, trying to parse through where to slot those SEC teams is difficult. And the second thing that was difficult, and I'm sure you ran into this too, is you have Penn State right now, who was already slotted at number 6 in the CFP rankings. And my question to you is, seeing them at 11, and I had them at 9, I believe. Do you believe that the SEC will play its way into hopping Penn State? Because if they lose again, they're out.
I think when the committee starts,
where to put the SEC teams was difficult for me too.
When the committee starts really parsing who have you beaten, it's not going to go well for Indiana and Penn State.
Yeah.
Unless Indiana beats Ohio State. Then that's a different story, though, because Indiana at that point will be in the Big Ten championship game against Oregon, and that will all take care of itself. But assuming Indiana loses to Ohio State, the who have you beat conversation with Indiana, Penn State, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, like all of these teams that could be in this conversation, it's not going to go well for them. The other team it might not go well for, and this is so I've got Texas as the SEC champ right now. Texas better not lose. Like, don't lose to Arkansas and do not lose to Texas A&M, because then you get into this situation of who did you beat? What's your best win? And that's not pretty, especially if they lose to Texas A&M, because their best win might wind up being Vanderbilt. And so they don't want to have that conversation either. The SEC is a mess. And so I had Georgia as the first team out, basically saying I think Tennessee's going to beat them. I don't know that Tennessee's going to beat them. I realize Vegas disagrees with me. That's a double-digit spread right now. But it was the cleanest way to do this. If Georgia beats Tennessee, I'm going to have to do it the messy way next week and have no choice and just guess at what's going to happen. But there's a clean way to do it where if Tennessee beats Georgia, Tennessee controls its own destiny for the SEC championship game. And basically Tennessee, assuming they beat Vanderbilt, was a big assumption, would play the winner of Texas A&M for the SEC championship. But again, there's a lot between now and then. I mean, what if Texas loses to Arkansas? Like all of this, what if Texas A&M somehow lost to Auburn? I realize this sounds far-fetched. Did anybody really think Georgia Tech was going to beat Miami on Saturday?
Yeah. The hardest part of this whole thing here, Andy, is giving in to what is probably going to happen. And I see Indiana is in your field. Indiana, I almost had to put on bubble watch, because if you look at the teams that are going to be in your first four out, and Georgia loses, that goes great, right? So they've got 3 losses. It's no big deal. But what you said about Texas, I find interesting, because you said that Texas, if they are to lose to A&M, could be in a pretty tough spot as a 10-2 team with no quality wins. They're going to be sitting there with
Penn State and Indiana, having the same who did you beat conversation.
Yes. But what's actually going to probably happen is, or there's a high likelihood of it happening, is that Texas wins the SEC, and that's not a problem for them. But what you will have maybe is a 2-loss Tennessee team with a win over Alabama being compared to Indiana and Penn State. And like, that's where things get a little murky, because right now everybody's in Indiana goes 11-1 and they're in mode. And I keep trying to tell people that if there's a team that has 2 losses, played in the SEC, has a strength of schedule that's 3 times better than Indiana's, and they have an Alabama win, like, the committee has already told us on Tuesday what they think of Indiana's schedule and where they're ready to rank them as an undefeated team. Like, Indiana, at the very least, has to play Ohio State to 2 scores. Like, there's no losing the 30.
They can't get blown out. Like, they cannot get blown out.
They get blown out in that game, they're going to be in deep, deep trouble. And the same thing goes for Penn State. Like, what if Penn State, finishes the year, and I realize that they have a much harder schedule than Indiana does on paper, but they also lack quality wins.
Yeah.
And it's just like A&M, for instance. Like, A&M, as a 2-loss team, potentially might have a situation where their resume is better. And we're not even taking into account, what else could go wrong in the SEC or who else.
Well, and remember, whatever A&M does well also benefits another team we haven't mentioned yet, is Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Everything A&M does well benefits Notre Dame. So, like, if A&M beats Texas, if A&M plays for the SEC championship, all that does is help Notre Dame, as long as Notre Dame keeps winning.
Yeah.
You know who it doesn't help? Texas, if Texas loses to Texas A&M. Because Notre Dame is going to be above Texas at that point, because it's going to be like, well, one of you won at Texas A&M. The other one lost at Kyle Field. So, again, Texas has got to beat Texas A&M.
And here's the other one,
very
too,
uncomfortable
Andy.
Conversation.
Here's the other one. So I guess we're assuming that Miami has 2 losses in this bracket, right? Because they're out.
Right. They would have lost to SMU.
But you know what? I saw some today. I know some of our colleagues have been attempting to do this exercise too, obviously. And I saw a lot of SMU at the 10. And I am very curious how they would explain that. And if they think that SMU could be at the 10, then does that mean that in the inverse of that explanation, that Miami would still be a more attractive team as a 2-loss team in the ACC than Indiana as a 1-loss team in the ACC in the Big Ten because Miami played in their title game? We talk about all the time how they can't be penalized for playing that extra game because they made it to their conference championship game. Miami would have an extra loss, but they would have an extra game.
We say that. We say they shouldn't be penalized, but we don't know what the committee is going to do. We had this conversation on the show after the games on Saturday night. Like, there's a high likelihood that the loser of the SEC championship game is a 3-loss team because they are 10-3, not 10-2, not 9-3, but 10-3. Well, what do you do with that team? Because guess who's going to go berserk if you leave that team out in favor of a team that didn't make the title game? Greg Sankey. And he's going to start pulling levers that change the college football playoff if you do that. So you got to, I don't know, the committee has to keep that in mind because that's not really their charge, but everybody should keep that in the back of your heads. Like, if, and it's probably the same thing in the Big Ten. I don't see a scenario of that happening in the Big Ten. But if the Big Ten runner-up or SEC runner-up were to be a 10-3 team and get left out, I think there would be hell to pay from the two most powerful conferences in the sport where they just start pulling levers.
Yeah, for sure. So, lastly, I see you have 4 SEC teams in your field.
Yes.
We talked on the show on Saturday night about how difficult it may or may not be to envision a world where 5 SEC teams make it. And I do not think that that's out of the question. Like, I was having a hard time with that.
I don't think it's out of the question either. I think if they get very serious about the who have you beaten conversation, again, Indiana and Penn State could have some issues depending on who they're being held up next to.
Yeah. Remind me, because it's been a long season, who is the best non-conference win for the SEC this year?
Ooh, that's a great question. Is it Georgia beating Clemson?
It probably is, right? And even that isn't aging well.
Right. And you also may have a South Carolina beating Clemson down the road if that happens.
And I think you are going to run into this discussion point, I think, in 2 weeks, where if the SEC starts to see a groundswell of success of teams who keep picking up quality wins against playing each other without any outside success, whether or not that's a fair metric of doing it. Like,
because there weren't really games that allowed for that, because we thought Texas-Michigan would be one of those games, but Michigan didn't hold up its end of the bargain.
Right. And like, if Michigan were an 11-1 team, that would certainly help. But the thing that is happening in the SEC right now is that you have a bunch of teams who are technically alive for the SEC championship because they're beating each other. And I think the assumption every single time a team beats another one of the SEC teams is that that's an awesome win. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that is actually true or if that's just based on perception. Like Ole Miss,
and you've got the Texas A&M loss to Notre Dame.
Right. And that's the biggest one.
If you're trying to make the argument the other way, you're gonna hold that up.
Yeah, and if you have A&M up there on the top, whatever, you're going to be like, well, they lost to Notre Dame, which is a team that maybe wouldn't have finished in the top 3 in the Big Ten this year. So I think that it's going to be an interesting slippery slope. But if you start hearing the 5-team SEC drum bang, that's going to be some bad news for, the Big 12 and the ACC. But the one thing that happened this weekend, Andy, for sure, is that the ACC and the Big 12 definitively became one-spot leagues.
They sure did.